This may be the weirdest looking map in my entire collection. That's quite fitting. It came from a cartographer whose creations are frequently claimed to be cribbed from ancient Atlanteans. You could make the case that the highest praise a thinker or creator could receive is that their work be mistaken for the product of advanced alien minds. Nikola Tesla comes to mind as a genius who attracts that sort of praise. In cartography, one man in particular has reached this pinnacle. Today we're going to look at a very, very alien map from the mind of Philippe Buache. But this is not a debunking video. This is a celebration of a scientist so creative that 250 years isn't enough time for some people to process his thoughts. Welcome to the Eye of History. If you like maps, and if you like deep dives into history, science, technology, and culture, then please like, share, and subscribe. It really helps nerdy channels like this one. Before we bring out today's map, let's take a quick look at the map Philippe Buache is best known for today. Modern writers have cited it as proof that a pre-Ice Age civilization once prospered in an ice-free Antarctica. It shows very clearly an Antarctica very different than what we see in modern maps. It's not covered by ice. It's actually separated into two continents, nearly surrounding an icy sea. It's drawn with considerable confidence. Note, this map was made in 1757, before Australia and Tasmania were fully delineated, and outside of Antarctica, our mapmaker clearly represents where his knowledge ends. But his Antarctica is fully realized, as though he was working from an account written by someone who had been there. Who could have been Buache's source? To at least a few crypto-historians, the obvious answer was the people who once lived in Antarctica, the members of a pre-cataclysmic civilization, an antipodal Atlantis. Stick around to the end of the video. We're going to form our own analysis of this special map. But before we probe too deeply into this mystery, let's first look at the author. In the first part of the 18th century, the premier cartographer of France, perhaps all of Europe, was Guillaume de Lisle. De Lisle learned astronomy from Cassini, cartography from Sanson, and was a member of the Royal Academy by age 27, royal cartographer at 43, and appointed tutor to the Dauphin by King Louis XIV. No more illustrious of a career is imaginable. And Philippe Buache was his heir in every way. Buache learned his craft working for de Lisle and married de Lisle's daughter. As he progressed in skill, he went from being de Lisle's apprentice to his collaborator, and eventually he took over de Lisle's workshop. He was admitted to the Royal Academy at age 30 and was royal cartographer at just 29. De Lisle is remembered today as one of the greatest cartographers of all time. His Wikipedia page has 2,200 words, 12 graphics, and 20 footnotes. As for the equally accomplished Buache, let's just say that he doesn't get quite the same treatment. Wikipedia barely covers him at all. Fame is not always fair. It certainly wasn't fair to Buache. He's remembered more as the subject of crank theories than as an influential scientist of his era. One wonders what his reputation would be today if that map of the Antipodes had never been printed, if his fame hadn't been tainted by his association with Atlanteans. But we have to understand that the Antarctic map was not an outlier. In fact, it was not even the most outrageous map Buache ever made. That distinction belongs to today's map. It was the product of a lifelong obsession for Buache, an illustration of a theory of the structure of the world which he developed and refined over the course of decades, right up to his death at the ripe age of 73. To modernize, it looks ridiculous, but as we'll see, there was true genius behind it. Unfortunately, genius is not always properly rewarded. Our map is a reprint of a map first printed in 1752, but its origins actually date 20 years further back, when Philippe Buache first began working on his theories of the structure of the world. It's a bit to take in at first. It is a map of the world in a polar projection, but not the usual sort. Buache was creative with his use of projections, and he deliberately distorted his projection to highlight where all the exploration was happening at the time. That is, the southern latitudes. A modest adjustment would have made it the Lambert azimuthal equal area projection, which hadn't been invented yet. And it's another example of how scientific fame narrowly missed Buache. Lambert made some simple tweaks to Buache's idea, and now it's his name in agate type on millions of modern atlas maps. Before we get to the main feature, there is an important detail here. Right here. At the time this map was made, Alaska was known only as an anonymous island at the northeast end of the Aleutians. But Buache's map confidently displays Alaska as a part of the American continent. It would be 1778 before Captain Cook's famous expedition confirmed what Buache already seemed to know, that Alaska was in fact a huge peninsula connected to the Americas. Cook was able to verify this 20 years later by talking to Russian seal hunters and indigenous Alaskans that he met there. It amuses me that Cook's 1778 voyage discovered one set of islands that became a U.S. state, and then undiscovered an island that also became a U.S. state. Did Buache have a direct line to those Russian seal hunters? How else did he know 20 years before Captain Cook himself? Or was it just a lucky guess? The answer is that Buache deduced that Alaska was a peninsula, and he did so by noticing a lack of evidence, something no one else noticed because no one noticed what wasn't there. Specifically, in all the reports received from explorers and adventurers in the North Pacific, none ever mentioned any significant icebergs. Had Alaska been an island, the nearby waters would have been as plagued by icebergs as is the North Atlantic. It was a very good deduction from a bit of non-evidence that no one else noticed. Buache would go further with his conjecture and state that Alaska and Siberia had once been linked together by what we call today the Bering Land Bridge. He was again absolutely correct. Here, though, the general idea was already in the air. The hypothesis dates back to 1590. Buache does deserve credit, though, for expanding the idea and giving it some tangible expression. This was Buache's modus operandi. Every major cartographer of the era made educated guesses as they filled in the blanks between what the explorers were able to report, but Buache was unique in that he took an explicitly scientific approach and he published the logic behind his conjectures. And his thinking was far more creative than any cartographer before or since, yet was always grounded in sound principles. Nearby, we see what appears at first to be an example of Buache's conjectural approach gone badly wrong. Here we see the Great Lake of the West, a large inland sea in what is now roughly Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. There is, of course, no such lake, which reflects rather poorly on our cartographer. But this glitch doesn't belong to Buache. It was something that he inherited from his master, Delisle, and which appears on many maps of the era. I have a particularly striking example from one of Buache's competitors, Jean Janvier, hanging in my living room. The mythic sea was not a random invention. It was due to the reports of one of the first explorers in the region, who upon navigating through the tangle of islands at the end of the Straits of San Juan de Fuca, discovered a large area of open water beyond. He turned around rather than explore the Straits of Georgia. He thought it was a substantial sea. No one knew its size for sure until decades later. Buache, of course, was simply following his mentor. He had no reason to dispute the discovery. But these are just side notes. What stands out about this map, and the reason Buache made it, is the web of what appears to be mountain chains that crisscross the whole globe. We easily recognize the Sierra Nevada, the Rockies, the Appalachians. The scale of the map doesn't allow for much detail, so we'll forgive Buache for the rather lazy depiction of the mountains of Europe, for example. The only other sort of feature Buache includes at all are rivers and a few large lakes. What is striking, though, is that Buache's mountain chains don't end at the edge of the continents. They extend through the seas, from West Africa through the Azores to Newfoundland, from California across the Pacific through some islands that are not Hawaii, check out this video to see what they really were, to the Marshall Islands and Marianas, and finally New Guinea, from Madagascar through the Seychelles and Maldives to Sumatra. When Buache made this map, there was no way to measure the depth of the open ocean. He could have had no idea what lay under the waves of the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian Oceans. So what were these about? Well, to understand what Buache was doing under the sea, we first need to look at what he was doing on the land. It might seem odd that Buache's mountains are so carelessly drawn. Look at the badly misdrawn Ghats of India, or the odd way in which the Alps get somehow connected to Denmark. Buache was the cartographer to the king. Such sloppy work does not seem compatible with his stature. It's as though the mountains were almost an afterthought. And so it was. Buache's real emphasis was not the mountains, but the rivers, or more specifically, the river basins. Buache had the idea that the Earth was best understood as a patchwork of basins, something akin to our modern idea of continental plates. In this conception, mountains were a border phenomenon, the natural rise at the boundary between the basins. Buache blithely lumps together volcanoes with limestone Alps, believing that their specific geology was an accident. What defined a mountain range were the basins it separated. And since to Buache mountains are mere boundaries, with the exception of a few plateaus, his mountain ranges are narrow strips. This forces him to do some interesting contortions. See how his Rocky Mountains zigzag to cover their immense width. The idea was revolutionary. The word watershed didn't exist in any language at the time, and if Buache is accorded any scientific fame today, it is for introducing the world to that concept. Ironically, he really wasn't the first, but that shall be the topic of a future video. So Buache's first idea was that basins are the fundamental structure of the Earth's surface. There was a second idea that further animated Buache's theory. Buache believed in the essential unity of the land and the sea, that, ignoring the thin sheet of water that covers the latter, they had the same underlying structure. This is what allowed him to conjecture that the seas, too, consist of a patchwork of basins, and that at the edge of the basins there are mountain ranges hidden from view, poking up here and there in the form of islands. No one else was treating Earth and sea as a single geophysical unit. Only the incredible polymath Wilhelm Leibniz was even thinking it, but his notes on the subject wouldn't be published until well after his death. So Buache deserves credit at least for being the first to publish, and in particular for being the first to apply the idea cartographically. It rapidly was taken as a general principle of geology. The basin idea? Not so much. Buache's peers in the Royal Academy gave that idea mixed reviews. Many appreciated Buache's gift for conjecture and gave his ideas a fair evaluation, but many others thought that scientists should limit themselves to concrete observation and certain proofs. They didn't see much difference between Buache's theory of basins and ranges and, for example, Edmund Halley's theory that the Earth was hollow and that there might be life within. But, as we'll see, Buache was standing on much firmer ground than Halley. Of course, this all looks rather ridiculous today. And it's not just that we know what the ocean floor looks like, and it isn't like this map. Today, it's not enough to draw some geological structure. Today, we expect there to be a sensible explanation of how it got that way. Something analogous to plate tectonics or the shrinking Earth theory that turns up in this video. We think of geology as a science of dynamic systems. We look at Buache's map and almost instinctively ask, what dynamic forces would create these patterns? And Buache doesn't have any answers. But when Buache was working on this map, few thought of geology as a study of processes, of dynamic forces shaping the landscape over time. Geology was a study of what is here now. Most intellectuals fell into two camps. Many thought the world was quite young. Others thought the world was eternally old. But regardless of whether you believed the world was young or eternal, the mindset was the same. Geology was not about processes, it was about structure. That structure might have been created 10,000 years ago or some eternity before, but it was static, motionless, or very nearly so. So Buache did not worry about how his basins and ranges were created. His only concern was how they hung together, assuming they exist. His hope was that his model of the structure of the Earth would guide geologists and explorers in productive ways to find new sources of minerals and new lands and to suggest further areas of research. His was a serious theory, which he developed over decades, tinkering with his map as explorers brought him new information. In fact, I consider it a textbook example of very good science. It just happens to be wrong. Which is often the way of things. Good science doesn't always lead to right results. The history of science is a history of mistaken hypotheses and misleading experiments, and the day that science ceases to be a parade of errors is the day that science loses its utility and power. What gives science its potency is not its immunity to error, but its capacity for correction. So let's look at what led Buache to his theory and see whether it's good science. I'll start with a comparison with arguably the greatest scientist of all time, Charles Darwin. Buache lived about 100 years before Darwin, but he operated in a similar vein. Both knew that what was true in the small should be true in the large. Not always, of course, but it is from small observations that large theories should be built. Darwin's theory of evolution started with an analysis of the beaks of finches. It was that small start, a study of finches on one set of isolated islands, that set Darwin on the path to deducing a general principle of adaptation through natural selection. Of course, Darwin didn't rely only on his finches. He made many other observations and developed his theory over the course of decades, but his pattern of thought was consistent. To develop a theory properly, find specific contexts in which key aspects of the theory can be isolated, and then study those closely. Darwin had his finches. Buache had his own particular laboratory, the English Channel. Here Buache was first inspired to consider the continuity of earth and sea, and here he is able to test his ideas. The open ocean was hopelessly remote, but the English Channel was close enough to Buache's home in Paris and shallow enough for its depth to be measured. Buache was luckier than Darwin. He didn't have to cross the world to find his laboratory. The result of Buache's work was this map, also published in 1752. It shows the western portion of the English Channel in a way that emphasizes the continuity between the landmass and the channel floor. It clearly shows the channel is identical to a river valley, only hidden underwater. Both of Buache's ideas are confirmed. The basin, or watershed, appears as the primary structural feature, and there's continuity between the terrestrial and the marine. Buache was fully justified in advancing his theory. And I should point out, he always referred to his ideas as conjectures. Like Darwin, he understood the limits of his methods. There is one thing suspicious, though. I checked against a modern chart, and the measurements Buache made along the center line are reasonably good, but those on either side are not. Buache claimed to have made all the measurements, but he did not publish any details or further data. It seems as though he did make some measurements, or have them made, but not throughout the whole channel, only along the center line. The rest, I'm afraid, was filled in rather, shall we say, artistically. The reason, it seems, was simple self-promotion. It happens that just the previous year, in 1751, another member of the Royal Academy, Nicolas Desmarais, had won a prize for writing the dissertation on the old junction of England with France, and reaching essentially the same conclusions. Buache claimed to have had the idea much earlier, about 2 decades earlier, but had not published in that time. Desmarais' dissertation did not have any map, which gave Buache an opportunity to promote his precedents through this map. We shouldn't be surprised that he embellished it just a little bit. In the end, things worked out. It appears there are no hard feelings between the two, and just a year later, a new version of Buache's map, less embellished, was inserted into Desmarais' treatise, and the credit was shared. The embellishments were a mistake, but where Buache truly went wrong was with his assumption that the English Channel was representative of the sea as a whole. It turns out that the continuity that Buache proposed is true, but it only applies to a narrow band around each continent. It would be another century before oceanographers fully realized the existence of these bands, the continental shelves, the edges of the continental plates. Buache also went wrong in assuming that his basins were the primary structural element. It was a reasonable idea in the context of a static world, and history would prove him almost right. Buache's basins can be thought of as a static version of modern plate tectonics. A prescient idea, but unfortunately, the foundations underneath Buache's understanding of geology were just too shaky. Now that we've established that Buache was not a crank, let's look again at this so-called Antarctic Atlantis. If the authors of those pseudoscientific studies had investigated even a little bit, they would have discovered that Buache explained every aspect of his antipodal map. There was logical science backing it all up, and not a single Atlantean or alien technology was required. In 1763, he wrote it all up, including a new map showing the behind-the-scenes details, and got it published in The Gentleman's Magazine. Our modern Atlantean theorists apparently weren't subscribers. Unlike earlier map makers, Buache was not motivated by the ancient concept of the Antipodes. If you are interested in the classic version of the antipodal story, you'll want to look at the map we explore in this video. Instead, Buache was attempting to explain a phenomenon that several explorers had observed in the Antarctic waters: icebergs. Today, icebergs need little explanation, but in Buache's time they were still poorly understood. Note that the glaciers of Norway do not calve icebergs of any size. The waters of the North Sea are too warm. Alaska's and Greenland's glaciers do calve icebergs, but they were not yet well explored. It was assumed at the time that the icebergs of the North Atlantic all came from the Arctic Ocean ice pack. However, some icebergs were clearly much too large to just be chunks of ice from the surface pack. Absent a better idea, the prevailing theory was that the icy water from the rivers of Canada and Siberia somehow accumulated or stacked the ice to form the larger bergs. That wasn't Buache's theory. That was the consensus of the best-informed minds in Paris and London. For Buache, that small observation was all he needed to make his map. The presence of icebergs, and the bergs reported by sailors were huge, meant that there had to be a polar sea in which the glaciers could form. This map shows the rest. Buache used his maps of the Arctic Ocean and the surrounding landmasses as a starting point. He knew the landmass must be of comparable size, otherwise the rivers wouldn't be sufficient to build the icebergs, and there must be a central sea, first to form the pack ice and also to concentrate the river ice. And the sea must have openings in the general vicinity of where the icebergs were seen. Buache estimated the size by simply copying portions of his maps of the Arctic. You can see Siberia plainly labeled. He finished the map by connecting his continent to New Zealand, which had not yet been circumnavigated and could plausibly have been part of the continent. In the text, he discusses the technical issues, in particular, whether such a continent could have the rivers necessary to build the behemoth icebergs. Much of the rest of the map is historical notes, comparing his version of the antipodal continent to those appearing in historic maps. From start to finish, Buache is clear. This is all a hypothesis. In fact, in all of Buache's conventional maps of the world, he leaves the Antarctic seas empty. It's a lovely exercise in deduction, but he never takes his theory too seriously. But as a map collector, I take Buache very seriously. In any sort of collecting, it is true that there is no such thing as bad publicity. Fame and infamy are equally valuable. John Wilkes Booth's autograph sells for more than Abraham Lincoln's. So I welcome any and all of the speculation around Buache and his Atlantean sources. It only helps the value of my map. Most of Buache's work consists of conventional atlas maps. His work is attractive, and they do well for maps of the era. Good specimens are worth around $300 to $500. But it's his more speculative and thematic maps that get collectors drooling. Here is a map that was part of a presentation Buache gave at the Royal Academy, which is essentially a copy of a manuscript map he obtained from Japan. Buache is practically the only cartographer who ever showed his sources in this way, so even though it's small, uncolored, and frankly unattractive, it still should fetch $1,000 or more. Our map is similar in interest level, size, and condition. Unfortunately, mine is a third printing and thus worth somewhat less, at least $500, likely a bit more. As for Buache's Antarctic maps, they start in price at somewhere around $3,000, which, if you ask me, seems a little low for an artifact from Atlantis. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And let me know in the comments your favorite tale of Atlantis.